This is the EU, an organization seen as one of the most successful in the world, a system that attracted investments, talent, and capital for decades. But that is about to change. New tax laws, already passed by national parliaments, could trigger a wave of capital flight unlike anything the continent has seen since the Cold War. Here's how it works. You buy a vintage Porsche 911. You pay 80,000 euros. You park it in your garage. A year passes. The market surges. Collectors are now paying 120,000 euros for models like yours. Your car appreciated 40,000 euros. But you haven't sold it. You haven't received a single euro. Then the tax bill arrives. The government has now assessed your car's appreciation. You owe 14,400 euros on the 40,000 euro gain. Cash. Due now. You don't have 14,400 euros. You used your savings to buy the car. So you sell. But the moment you list it, the bubble bursts. The best offer you get is 75,000. 5,000 less than you paid. You sold at a loss to pay your tax on a gain that never existed. Starting January 2028, the Netherlands will tax unrealized capital gains at 36%. The Dutch House of Representatives passed the law in February 2026. The Senate is expected to follow. This isn't a theory, it's live legislation. And if you think this stops at the Dutch border, you haven't been paying attention to how the EU operates. To understand why Europe is crossing this line, we need to examine what's actually happening in the Netherlands. The mechanism reveals the fiscal pressures every other EU nation is facing. The law is called the Actual Return in Box 3 Act. It imposes a flat 36% tax on all investment gains, realized or not, starting January 2028. The Netherlands divides personal income into 3 boxes. Box 1 covers employment income and home ownership. Box 2 applies to substantial business interests, owning at least 5% of a company. Box 3 is savings and investments. For decades, Box 3 taxed a fictional return. The government assumed your assets earned a certain percentage, then taxed that assumed income whether you made it or not. During years of near zero interest rates, savers were taxed on returns they never received. The Dutch Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional in 2021. The system violated property rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. You can't tax income that doesn't exist. The government tried fixes. They adjusted the assumed rates. They allowed taxpayers to prove their actual returns were lower. Nothing worked. By 2024, the Treasury was losing 2.3 billion euros annually as investors successfully challenged their assessments. So the government chose the most aggressive option: tax actual returns, including unrealized gains. If your portfolio rises by 10,000 euros over the course of the year, the tax authority treats that paper gain as taxable income. You owe 3,600 euros. It doesn't matter if you've sold anything. It doesn't matter if the assets are illiquid. You must find 3,600 euros in cash. Real estate and startup shares are exempt. For those assets, the government adopted a capital gains approach. Tax only applies when you sell. The Treasury knows the system created liquidity problems. They applied it anyway to liquid assets because they needed the revenue. The bill includes a 1,800 euro tax-free annual return. Losses above 500 euros can be carried forward indefinitely to offset future gains. But these provisions don't solve the core issue. Several coalition members admitted this isn't their preferred approach, but the Supreme Court left them no choice. The old system was illegal. The new system generates revenue. The alternative was losing billions. Cointelegraph warned of capital flight. Crypto holders in particular face a choice: pay 36% annually on paper gains or leave. The Dutch didn't invent this desperation. They're just the first to codify it. EU nations don't innovate tax policy in isolation. They study each other's experiments, waiting to see which revenue extractions succeed without triggering mass immigration. Spain offers the clearest precedent. In 2022, the government introduced a temporary solidarity wealth tax on net worth above 3 million euros. Rates ranged from 1.7% to 3.5%, depending on the region. The tax was designed to fund pandemic recovery and was scheduled to expire after 2 years. It didn't expire. By 2024, the temporary measure became permanent. The threshold dropped to 700,000 euros in some autonomous communities. What began as emergency legislation is now embedded in the Spanish tax code. The consequences were immediate. High earners relocated to Andorra, a tiny principality in the Pyrenees with a 10% flat tax. Crypto traders moved to Dubai, where capital gains taxes don't exist. Digital entrepreneurs shifted their tax residency to Portugal before that country closed its non-habitual resident loophole in 2024. Spain didn't gain revenue, it lost tax base. But the political narrative was successful, and finance ministers across Europe took notes. France operates a layered extraction system. Capital gains face a 30% flat tax, but social charges push the effective rate to 47.2% for high earners. Real estate holdings above 1.3 million euros face a 0.5% annual wealth tax. The system extracts revenue at every stage. When you earn, when you hold, when you sell. Germany has tightened inheritance tax enforcement. Loopholes that allowed family businesses to pass wealth across generations have been closed. Cross-border asset transfers face increased scrutiny. The Finanzamt is tracking wealth flows more aggressively than at any point since reunification. When one nation successfully implements a new revenue stream without triggering capital flight, others follow. The Dutch experiment is being watched closely in Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. If the Netherlands can tax unrealized gains at 36% and retain its tax base, the model spreads. But the most significant extraction mechanism isn't wealth taxes, it's energy taxes. EU revenue from CO2-related taxes tripled from 15 billion euros in 2017 to over 50 billion euros in 2023. Energy and transport taxes now represent 95% of all environmental tax revenue, totaling 325 billion euros annually, or 1.9% of EU GDP. These taxes are framed as corporate climate policy. The reality is different. Households bear 44% of energy taxes, 115 billion euros annually. They pay 67% of transport taxes, 43 billion. Germany's renewable energy surcharge, the EEG Umlage, added 6.5 billion euros annually to household electricity bills before being partially reformed. Similar levies exist across the EU. These aren't optional. You can't opt out of heating your home. You can't avoid driving to work. The tax is embedded in the price of existence, and it grows with every new climate policy initiative. In 2023, Ursula von der Leyen referenced using private savings to fund EU recovery financing. The rhetoric is shifting from implicit to explicit. Your wealth is a resource the state can access. The EU is also pushing regulatory harmonization. A common consolidated corporate tax base proposal would eliminate tax competition between member states. The entire EU becomes one giant tax trap. But these aren't just opportunistic revenue grabs. There's a structural mechanism at work that makes rising taxes not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. The EU working age population, those between 20 and 64, is projected to shrink by 35 million between 2020 and 2050. During that same period, the 65 and over cohort will grow by 21 million. In 1990, there were roughly 4.5 working-age Europeans for every retiree. By 2050, that ratio falls to 1.7. Fewer taxpayers must fund the same welfare obligations. Pensions don't shrink because the population ages. Healthcare costs don't decline because fewer people are working. The burden per worker increases. EU member states collectively owe over 12 trillion euros in sovereign debt. As interest rates normalized after 2022, debt servicing costs surged. Since 2000, the euro has approximately lost 30% of its purchasing power against a basket of goods. Inflation erodes savings, but governments benefit. Tax brackets are calculated on nominal figures. As prices rise, nominal income rises, pushing taxpayers into higher brackets even if their real purchasing power hasn't increased. It's a silent tax that requires no legislative vote. Walk into a supermarket in Rome or Berlin. In 2020, a litre of olive oil cost 4 euros. Today, it's 8 euros. A loaf of bread was €1.50. Now it's €2.80. Your monthly electricity bill was €80. Now it's €140. Although our salary increased 8% over 4 years, your costs increased 40%. And the government taxes you on the 8% nominal gain, not the 32% real loss. You're getting poorer but paying more in taxes. That's the mechanism. Governments face a fiscal constraint. They can't cut spending without triggering political backlash. Pensions, healthcare, and public sector wages are protected. They can't print money freely. The European Central Bank constrains monetary policy to prevent runaway inflation. They can't raise traditional income taxes much higher without triggering immigration or underground economic activity. When you can't tax income harder without killing economic activity, you tax accumulated wealth. It's the only remaining reservoir of untapped revenue. The cycle reinforces itself. Higher taxes lead to slower growth. Slower growth reduces tax revenues. Lower revenues create pressure for even higher taxes. Capital flight shrinks the tax base further. The remaining taxpayers face even higher rates to cover the shortfall. Historical precedents exist. The UK imposed a 98% top marginal tax rate in the 1970s. It didn't solve the debt crisis. It triggered brain drain and capital exodus. Thatcher reversed course, but only after a decade of economic stagnation. Today's EU has fewer exit options. The OECD's base erosion and profit-shifting framework coordinates tax policy across borders. The Common Reporting Standard shares financial information between countries. FATCA extends US tax reach globally. Tax havens are being systematically eliminated through international agreements. The Dutch unrealized gains tax isn't a radical policy. It's the logical endpoint of a system running out of options. When the tax base is shrinking, the debt is growing, and the currency is weakening. The money has to come from somewhere. The answer to that question is already being telegraphed by the EU's leadership. Return to Ursula von der Leyen's statement about using private savings to fund EU recovery. It wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a policy signal. The endgame isn't just national wealth taxes, it's transnational wealth extraction. Taxation coordinated at the EU level, not just within individual member states. Spain demonstrated the mechanism at the national level. A temporary solidarity levy becomes permanent. The threshold drops, the rates rise. But the structural shift is moving from national extraction to EU-level revenue collection. The EU has committed to net zero emissions by 2050. CO2-related taxes have already tripled in 6 years, from €15 billion to €50 billion. They will double again by 2030. Households will bear the majority of the increase, despite having the least ability to avoid consumption. Energy and transport taxes function as flat consumption levies. They hit those who can't afford electric vehicles or home solar installations the hardest. The wealthy optimize around them. The middle class pays the climate bill. New EU building efficiency directives make this pressure worse. Starting in 2030, existing homes must meet stricter energy performance standards. If your apartment or house doesn't comply, you're required to retrofit. The average cost for a mandated heat pump installation in an older building is €15,000 to €30,000. Add insulation upgrades, new windows, and solar panel requirements, and you're looking at €50,000 or more. If you can't afford it, you can't legally rent or sell your property. You're holding a depreciating asset that costs a fortune to bring up to code. This isn't a tax on the wealthy. It's a wealth transfer from homeowners to green energy contractors, mandated by Brussels, funded by your savings. But the most significant shift isn't happening at the national level. It's happening in Brussels. The EU is moving beyond national contributions to direct EU-level taxation. Proposed own resources include 30% of emissions trading revenue, 75% of carbon border adjustment proceeds, and new levies on corporate profits, digital services, and financial transactions. Citizens would be taxed by their national government and directly by Brussels to service the €750 billion in joint COVID-19 recovery debt. What began as temporary emergency borrowing is becoming permanent fiscal integration. Unlike national parliaments, where voters can reject tax increases or vote out governments, EU's own resources are negotiated by the Council and Commission. There's minimal democratic oversight. You can't vote out the tax collectors. The Dutch aren't radical, they're just early. Europe is taxing money people never received because it has no other choice. The convergence is complete. Shrinking populations, rising debt, weakening currency, and political constraints create one outcome: inevitable wealth extraction. How long before the Dutch model becomes the EU standard? How long before unrealized gains taxes spread from Amsterdam to Athens? The tax you can't escape isn't the one on your paycheck. It's the one on assets you're still holding, waiting for a better time to sell that may never come.